Sudani is a Scottish Liberal Democrat politician who was Chief Secretary to the Treasury in the UK between 2010 and 2015. When the 2010 general election produced a hung parliament, Sudani was one of the four-man Liberal Democrat negotiating team that drew up the coalition agreement with the Conservatives at the time. He was initially appointed as Secretary of State for Scotland, but at the end of May, just a couple of weeks later, in 2010, he was promoted as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and he was knighted in last year's 2015 dissolution honours lists. Following his departure from the House of Commons in Westminster, he was confirmed as Vice President at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and it's about the challenges and the opportunities that role brings that Sudani is chiefly here to tell us about. There's just one interesting point of note that in November 2012, the Cairngorm Brewery in Scotland launched a beer called Ginger Rodent with his own agreement and cooperation. I don't think we've got any bottles in the bar downstairs, but it's certainly something that we would look to try and import. And the brewery there is in his former parliamentary constituency. So can we please welcome Sudani Alexander?
Thank you, Nigel, for that very kind introduction and for mentioning those examples from my past life. I'm deeply disappointed that you don't have Ginger Rodent here on tap. I'm not even sure if they brew it anymore, though I dare say if you ordered some, they would do it specially. And thanks also for the reminder of my very brief period as Secretary of State for Scotland. I was Secretary of State for Scotland for 17 days. And a friend of mine said I was the youngest, shortest serving and most successful Scottish Secretary in history. Quite how those things were measured, I really don't know. But thank you very much for inviting me, and it is a great pleasure to be here at this prestigious institution, and I look forward to some questions afterwards as well. And it's also good to be back here in Hong Kong again. I think my upbringing gives me a tiny little bit of empathy with Hong Kong. I also grew up on a small island, in my case called Colonsay, in the Inner Hebrides of Scotland. It's about half the size of Hong Kong Island, but I calculated with 0.01% of the population. And there are other similarities. Like Scotland, the welcome here is always very warm, and you sometimes at least lay on the rain to remind us of home, though not today. The typhoon seems to have been diverted. And perhaps that's why over many decades, Scots have been attracted to Hong Kong, and many have successfully made their lives and careers here. I think a couple of years ago you had Nicola Sturgeon as a speaker. I was heavily involved in the referendum campaign about Scottish independence in 2014, though on the other side to her. And I noticed that following the result, the South China Morning Post published a very handy infographic of the role of Scots in Hong Kong, which included the fact that in 1872, it took 180 days to travel from Scotland to Hong Kong, a journey which apparently now only takes 12 hours and 22 minutes, a very precise figure. It says much about the improvements to transport infrastructure in the intervening period, and perhaps also is an illustration of why we islanders have a particular understanding of the benefits of investing in infrastructure. It should therefore be no surprise that the Hong Kong government has been very supportive of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank since its inception, and we are grateful for that support. And indeed, we look forward to the prospect of Hong Kong becoming a member of the AIIB in its own right in the first half of 2017, and I'm sure the relationship will deepen as time progresses, as this territory is also one important centre for many of the services that infrastructure investors require. As you said, prior to moving to Beijing, where I now live with my family, to take up my office with the AIIB, I was a minister in the UK coalition government for 5 years and a member of the House of Commons for 10. And over the last 18 months, the UK has taken two important decisions about its role in international institutions. The first, in which I was intimately involved as a minister, was the UK's decision to become the first major developed country to join the AIIB. And the second, which I watched unfolding on television from halfway around the world, was the referendum vote in favour of Britain leaving the European Union. I'll spend most of my time talking about the first of those and then conclude with a few personal observations about the second. The proposal to create the AIIB came from the Chinese government, and it was the right proposal at the right time. Following the financial crisis, governments around the world have understood the importance of infrastructure investment to raise long-term economic productivity. Improving connectivity helps to make markets work better, it boosts economic growth, it raises living standards. Infrastructure, of course, is crucial to tackling climate change. The need for infrastructure investment in this region is huge. To give some idea of the context, it's worth remembering that the value of existing infrastructure in the world is estimated by McKinsey's to be $50 trillion. From 2015 to 2030, they also estimate that global demand for new infrastructure could amount to more than $93 trillion US. Developing countries in Asia account for 41% of that overall infrastructure need, and of course there's a massive gap between current investment levels and the amount of money that needs to be invested. So the need for a new institution to help bridge that gap is clear. But it's also important to say that while setting up the AIIB was an important Chinese initiative, it's not a Chinese bank. The AIIB is a multilateral financial institution created by 57 founding signatories and is accountable to all of them. We've been established with the highest standards of 21st century governance. Our policies, such as our procurement policies or our environmental and social standards, match those of our closest partners like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. Our non-resident board meets 4 times a year in Beijing. China has 1 member of that board out of 12, and ensures our shareholders have strong involvement in the policy and strategy of the bank, while the president, Jin Liqun, and his senior management team are responsible for the operations. The AIB is still a very young organization, but it has a strong commitment to working closely with partners, including private sector partners, to help address that infrastructure gap. And with those 57 founding members coming from across the world, and 3/4 of the $100 billion of shares held by members in the Asia region, we have strong support. We started work in January of this year. We're building the institution, recruiting expert staff, specialist staff from around the world. We agreed our first loans to infrastructure projects in June of this year, just 6 months after we'd started work. Loans in Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Tajikistan. We can invest in all parts of our region and indeed beyond the Asia region if there are good projects that deliver tangible benefits to Asia. We also have agreements or memorandums of understanding in place with the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the EIB, and we've already agreed to co-finance projects with the first 3 on that list. The scale of Asia's infrastructure challenge is so huge that there's plenty for all these institutions to do, and it will be done better if we continue to cooperate closely together. So the skeptics' forecast that the AIB would seek to compete against existing institutions has, I think, been debunked by our institution, for which cooperation and partnership are watchwords. We've also been very clear from the outset that we'll operate in a way that is lean, clean, and green. Occasionally mistranslated as lean, clean, and mean. But lean, we mean building our operations carefully and using our resources as efficiently as possible. Clean obviously means high standards of governance, transparency, zero tolerance for corruption. But I also want to dwell a little bit on the importance we attach to being a green bank. The Paris Agreement, ratified by the US and China at the G20 in Hangzhou, saw countries around the world make important commitments to reduce carbon emissions. And these will require huge amounts of investment in new infrastructure, in addition to the existing infrastructure gap. And of course, infrastructure and climate change are closely connected. 40% of fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions come from the energy sector, 20% from the transport sector. Investments made in the next 15 years will either lock in a high carbon growth path with many stranded assets, infrastructure that becomes redundant sooner than expected, or will accelerate the transition towards low carbon growth. And 2/3 of that additional investment demand is concentrated in the energy and transport sectors. Now, many green technologies have higher capital costs but lower operating costs, and thus depend on the availability of capital to invest at a reasonable cost. So unlocking this investment will require financing from a wide range of sources. Governments have made commitments through the Paris process, but will be unable to finance that in full from their own balance sheets. As I said, we opened our doors as a bank just a few weeks after that Paris agreement, and we see a key role for the AIIB as a green bank to help our members meet those commitments. And given the growing population and the forecast rapid pace of urbanization and economic growth in Asia, this region ultimately will be fundamental to whether the world succeeds or fails to meet the challenge of climate change. Hong Kong's MTR, for example, is recognized around the world as an example of a well-functioning, sustainable and growth-boosting transport system. How many cities around the world could benefit from such a system? How many new cities in Asia will need such systems if they're to be livable and sustainable? And of course, infrastructure investments of those sorts have strong so-called lock-in effects. In other words, they have a major impact on the future pattern of economic development. So the decisions that are being made in the coming years in Asia about what to invest in, what not to invest in, will determine whether the region is able to fulfill its growth and development aspirations whilst avoiding the catastrophic effects of climate change. The existing infrastructure gap in Asia, in fact, offers the opportunity to build sustainable infrastructure from the start, and so to leapfrog, if you like, to more productive, less carbon-intensive modes of development. China, for example, is among the world's leaders in renewable energy, which it was reported recently now contributes around a quarter of the power generated here. International financial institutions such as the AIIB can make a big difference, not only in providing capital directly, but also in unlocking projects for private sector investment. The scale of the need for green infrastructure finance will be impossible to meet without a very substantial increase in the amount of private sector funding. And that is why unlocking that funding is another key priority for the AIIB. We'll be thinking in particular about what financial instruments we can offer and that we need to develop. We can make equity investments, offer guarantees as well as loans. Green bonds could be an important element of our money raising. We've established a special fund which will provide grants to low and middle income member countries to help them bring forward projects to a point where they can be considered for financing. China has generously committed $50 million to this new fund, and we expect others to contribute in the future. There is a great deal for us to do at the AIIB to develop our strategy, our team, and the pipeline of projects so that we can fulfill both our mandate and also the expectations that exist for the first new multilateral development bank of the 21st century. People will rightly judge us by our actions, not by our words, and we also look forward to welcoming many new members to the bank in the coming year, including Hong Kong and Canada, who've both expressed their wish to join, who can help us to ensure that those expectations are fulfilled. And I hope that our early progress has helped to show that the AIIB can make a big contribution to ensuring that Asia has the infrastructure it needs to develop in a way that creates wealth and prosperity and is environmentally sustainable. And we look forward to working with you, all of you, and with Hong Kong as the bank develops. And that, of course, is a major reason that the UK made the early decision to join the bank. It was a decision that was at the time seen as far-sighted and bold. Now, time will tell whether the same will be said about the referendum vote on EU membership, the consequences of which are only just starting to unfold. I've been asked to say a few words too about the consequences of Brexit in my personal capacity as former Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And let me start by saying that the AIIB does not have views on these matters, and so these are personal observations. It's of course public knowledge that I voted for the UK to remain. And it is at this stage, I think, hard to be clear what happens next. A great deal remains to be decided, and all of it is subject to negotiation. But let me make a few observations. First, it was sensible for the UK authorities to take time to work out exactly what they want Brexit to mean in practice before starting negotiations. A few months taken now to think through the details is very wise, not least because Brexit is one of the most complex challenges the UK system has had to deal with for many decades. Every stage will be difficult and potentially controversial, both within the UK and in the rest of Europe, so it will not be plain sailing. Second, we need to work on the assumption that Brexit goes ahead. While some might wish the decision was reversed, no one should assume that it will be. So pro-Europeans should focus their efforts at the moment on getting the new arrangements right. Third, I hope that both the UK and the EU will be looking for the most economically advantageous and least damaging deal possible. As my former colleague and good friend Nick Clegg, the former Deputy Prime Minister, pointed out in the Financial Times last week, there's nothing straightforward or quick about securing trade deals with other countries. So ensuring that the UK remains as engaged as possible with the European single market is vitally important both to Britain and to Europe. And fifth, for the UK, other alliances and international relationships will matter all the more. The decision to join the AIIB showed the UK was enthusiastic about engaging closely with Asia and willing to take some risks to do so. We are in a so-called golden era of UK-China cooperation, and there's plenty of scope to build on that. The UK also needs to build its ties with India, Japan, and other developed and developing economies around the world. The UK has always been open and outward-looking. To succeed in future, it will need to be even more so. And lastly, we're in something of a false dawn at the moment. Some have pointed out to single economic statistics to suggest that the consequences are not as bad as some perhaps had forecast. That's welcome, but any economist would warn not to read too much into single snapshots. We should not be lulled into a false sense of security. The path that Britain's chosen is a difficult one, and there'll be plenty of ups and downs along the way. Now, every year at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, a prize is awarded for the winning joke. This year, the winner was, "My dad suggested I register for a donor card. He's a man after my own heart." I'm sure the comedian who thought it up delivered it rather better than that. There's no donor card available to help the UK deal with Brexit, but we hope with all our hearts that they have the wisdom and determination to get the next decisions right. In the meantime, my colleagues and I at the AIIB will be working hard to build an institution that can make a difference in this region. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Danny. We have time for some questions. Please raise your hand and then wait for the roving mic to come to you so that everyone can hear.
As you mentioned in your speech, AIIB earlier this year approved 4 projects. Could you shed some light on why these 4 projects got picked, and was there any debate or disagreement among the board members when it comes to this decision? Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, the bank is very young, and for the early projects, we very much evaluated the many ideas that had come to us. These were projects that were in an advanced state of readiness, so we could process them quickly. In 3 of the cases, they had been worked on in detail by other international funding partners. The ADB in the case of the Pakistan project, the World Bank in the case of the Indonesian project, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in the case of the Tajikistan project. And so we were able to benefit from the work that they had done in order to process our own loan quickly. I don't think it's appropriate for me to go into the details of internal discussions on our board. but I think everyone was enthusiastic about these projects, and obviously we're developing a pipeline of projects that will bring forward many more investment decisions for us to make at future board meetings this year and in future years. And I think you could well expect that projects will be in many other parts of our region, as well as in those countries that we chose for our first projects.
Thank you. The gentleman right at the back in the veranda there.
I do feel as though I'm right at the back here, actually. Hi. My name's Julian Vella from KPMG. You quite rightly made the point that the scale of investment in infrastructure across Asia is such that governments and banks or development banks will need to engage with the private sector to support that investment. But many of the Asian markets are not currently in a position to accept private investment because of the state of their institutional structures, corruption, legal systems, regulatory environments, etc., and banking systems. I was just wondering whether the AIIB saw a role for itself beyond just financing projects, but in supporting capacity building to enable that private sector finance to be provided to a number of projects in those markets.
It's a very important question, and thank you for it. And it's something that we are thinking through in detail at the moment. What are the best roles that we can play to help catalyse much more private sector investment in those sorts of projects? And I think the answer to your question is potentially yes, but it depends on the circumstances, perhaps the nature of the sorts of projects that we want to do in particular jurisdictions. I think one measure of that is of our role in terms of private sector investment is in terms of how much investment we can crowd in. And we're talking a lot at the moment to potential partners about what are the particular issues that need to be addressed in order to make that easier. I think we may even be talking to some of your own colleagues on that issue. It's worth saying that we have potentially quite a wide range of kind of financial products and interventions at our disposal, not just lending to projects, but potentially also equity investments, offering guarantees, other sorts of lending structures, B loans and so on, which can, which offers potentially quite a wide suite of options that can help to give private sector partners the security or the stability that they're looking for to back projects. But I think we start from the position that if the wider need for infrastructure in Asia is to be met, which is in the end, one of the major reasons why our bank exists at all, then the need it dwarfs official sources, be they international institutions or indeed domestic governmental sources, and so ways simply have to be found to make this asset class of Asian infrastructure more attractive to private sector investors, and so we'll be spending a lot of time working on that and trying to work out what the right interventions for our bank are.
What else could the AIIB do? Could you, for example, take first loss risk on, say, land acquisition and the delay in there, or unproven traffic numbers on roads? Now, these are eye-watering risks that the private sector can't take or won't take, yet governments still expect them to take. And maybe the AIIB can step into there with some sort of back-to-back arrangement with host governments to the extent that the risk does eventuate, but be a lot more imaginative than the IFC and the ADB have been to date, who after all spend most of their money on A loans and B loans, which are all very well, but if you're a commercial bank in there losing money alongside the IFC and the ADB, that's no great consolation.
Thank you very much. And I'd start by stressing the point I made earlier, which is that we're at a very early stage of our development, and that means both that we're still thinking through these questions, but also that we're very open to suggestions about what is the most, what are the most useful things that we can do. So I take your comments in that in that spirit. Our bank, we fund projects on commercial terms. We want our projects to be bankable. We have I mentioned our special fund, that's separate to our sort of normal lending resources, and it's there to give grants to less developed countries to help develop their projects to a stage where they are investable, both for us and potentially for partners. So there's one set of interventions there which is about helping to ensure that the projects which eventually come forward are of the right quality, and that I think is more good investable projects would be good for everybody. And then the sorts of risks we can take, well, that's of course something we have to evaluate. We have to ensuring that we are financially sound. We're dealing with taxpayers' money here from around the world. We have to be very careful with that. Is important. But the answer to your question is we can consider all of those things, and now is a good time for us to be thinking about the sorts of ideas you've put forward, because we need to develop interventions that can make a difference without being sort of cavalier about it, that can help to crowd in the sort of investment from the private sector that is needed.
Can I just bring you kicking and screaming back to Brexit for 1 second, and understanding these views are personal. However, Nicola Sturgeon continually reminds us that Scotland voted decisively to remain in the European Union. I think I'm right in saying that every English constituency voted to leave the European Union. How do you think those two things can be reconciled?
I think it's not quite fair to say every English constituency voted to leave.
I must check my facts.
I think certainly London voted quite heavily to remain, and I think there were some other cities in England that also did. So I think the picture is a wee bit more nuanced than that. I'm not aware of any Scottish constituency that voted to leave, however. So to that extent, your characterization is accurate. Who knows what will happen in terms of that discussion in Scotland? I'm not involved in Scottish politics anymore. I was defeated by one of Nicola's colleagues in my constituency in Inverness, so I have to have a degree of humility about these questions. But I mean, I was one of the Scottish voters who voted to remain, and I guess Scotland has long had a slightly different take on European matters to when you can go back to the 16th century and the old alliance between Scotland and France before the Act of Union, as an example of that. Whether that leads Scotland to want to make political changes or Nicola Sturgeon to put them forward, I really have no idea.
Thank you very much. Questions from the floor?
So Danny, I just want to ask, you mentioned that in the case of financing, you refer to private equity and bank financing. I was just wondering whether, in the scheme of things, AIIB would consider, using securitization as one of the means of financing, as we know that, in terms of the finances needed, you yourself mentioned 50 trillion for the whole world, and in the context of Asia, it probably needs at least something like $8 trillion US. So against the background, there is really there's a need, a dire need, for financing. And so I was just wondering whether securitization might be one of the means. Thank you.
It's certainly something we could consider. It's not something that we have a view on at the moment. As I said, we're open to suggestions. I mean, it's interesting to look at some of the countries around the region looking at ideas about asset recycling, for example, in order to generate resources for new projects. Securitization can provide a similar sort of route. So it's certainly something we could look at. We haven't done so yet, and I'm not sure there's much for me to add at this point beyond that.
Thank you. We have a question from the veranda.
Thank you, Lord Alex. I thought I'd better emerge from the veranda so
Thank
continue
you
your
very much,
question. Andrew Seaton, British Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for your comments. My question is about what particular, I guess, gap in the market you see for AIB. You've got the existing multilateral institutions, the World Bank family, you've got the ADB. Clearly, you've got your focus on infrastructure, but both those organizations are very much involved in infrastructure investment in the region. And I wonder if you just say a bit about, as I said, your particular gap in the market, either in terms of where you focus your projects or in terms of some of the other aspects that have come out in questioning about your financing models and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. It's an old politician's trick, of course, but I'd start by questioning the premise of the question, in the sense that Of course, the AIB has a different mandate to other institutions. We are exclusively focused on infrastructure. Other institutions have a mandate to look much more broadly, and that includes infrastructure. But I'd say rather than looking for a gap in the market, I would say that the scale of the need is so huge that the resources of all these institutions are less than, by themselves, the scale of the financing that needs to be mobilized. And that's why the model we've been developing is much more one based on working in cooperation and in partnership with these other existing multilateral institutions. We've signed a detailed framework on co-financing with the World Bank, and we've already co-financed one project, and I'm sure there'll be more coming down the pipeline. Likewise with the Asian Development Bank and with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and with the European Investment Bank. So I think it's much more about building partnerships and working together to find the right answer in particular cases, and for us to develop our capacity very much as an organization that specializes in infrastructure, that specializes in project finance. I'd mention 3 areas that I think will be of particular interest and focus to the AIIB. The first I dwelt on in my remarks, which is the green purpose of the bank, the need for an organization that has a particular focus on sustainable green infrastructure. I think that's one area of focus for the bank. Building connectivity in the region is another critical area of focus for the AIIB. There are economic as well as social and environmental benefits to improving connectivity between countries and within countries. And then the third is the one that a couple of questions have dwelt on, which is crowding in, mobilizing, whatever term you want to use, additional private sector funding. So I think those are 3 things which will be kind of among the strategic priorities for the AIIB, but we are still working on that in more detail and talking to our shareholders about it. But I think it's safe to say those will be 3 areas of importance to our bank, and we'll work closely together with other institutions in order to further those purposes.
I think one of the questions people have is the extent to which the AIIB's lending and investment decisions will be subject to Beijing's political priorities. What's been your experience of that so far?
My experience is that the AIIB works as a good, well-governed international institution should, which is that we have good processes, that we are answerable and accountable to all of our members, that our board of directors, which has 12 members, 1 Chinese, 1 Indian, who represent large shareholders, the others represent constituencies or groups of shareholders, and that those people collectively work together with the management to take the decisions, and that this is an institution which is focused on investing in high quality projects that meet the policies that we've already agreed. I mean, you can look at the governance arrangements, you can look at the requirements of openness and transparency that we've put in place, the environmental and social policies, the procurement policies, and so on. And they, I'd say, stand comparison very easily with the similar frameworks in other international financial institutions. And I think that we work very well in that way, and not in any other way.
I'm Sarah Monks, a member of the club. This builds in a way on the previous question. The early discussions about the AIIB coincided to a large extent with President Xi Jinping articulated more and more his vision of one belt and one road. And I think in the minds of many people, the two became somewhat conflated. Although you've just explained that it is a multilateral institution, the AIIB, not a Chinese bank, how do you see the framework of the One Belt, One Road coinciding in any ways with the priorities of the bank?
It's a very important question, and One Belt, One Road is an important policy of one of our major shareholders. But we are not there to further the particular policy of one shareholder, but to deliver the collective aspirations of all of the 57 members who came together to form the bank. And I suspect there will be areas of overlap and there'll be areas of difference. We will invest in projects in the sort of One Belt, One Road areas. We'll invest in projects in other parts of our region. And those decisions will all be based on the same basic tests that I explained earlier in terms of the strategy that the bank lays down, in terms of projects that fit within the policy frameworks that we've agreed, that come out of discussions that we have with our members or are brought to us by private sector institutions, and each project is evaluated on its own merit. So there will no doubt be areas of coincidence, there'll be areas of difference, but those will all come from the AIB applying its own decision-making methods and policies in its own way.
When the chairman of the Standing Committee of the People's Congress was here in May, he described Hong Kong as a hub for the Belt and Road in the sense of the provision of financial services, financial products, professional services, etc. And that's been built into the Chief Executive's policy address also. From your perspective, do you have a view on what, in practical terms, that might mean in terms of support out of Hong Kong and participation in the Belt and Road, but also in the broader activities of the AIIB?
Well, I think the gentleman who you referred to is far better qualified than I to speak about how the Chinese government sees these matters. So let me just dwell from the AIB's perspective. And I think it's first worth saying that our procurement policy commits us to open international procurement, both for our own services and for the way in which projects we finance conduct their procurement. So we don't have any sort of national preferences or direct people in a particular way. My observation would be, from my discussions here and seeing what happens in Hong Kong, that Hong Kong is a very important centre for many of the services that infrastructure projects need and that infrastructure finance needs to develop. You mentioned them already, but the legal services, financial services, professional services. It's not the only such hub in the world, but it's a very important one. And particularly in respect of the subject that I was talking about and that came up in some of the earlier questions about how can you best go about taking the right sort of decisions to mobilize more private sector capital to invest in infrastructure. I suspect that there's a particular role for the sorts of businesses that are based in Hong Kong, and for people in Hong Kong to take a lead in thinking about those questions. Likewise on green finance, again, there are opportunities there, and as I say, Hong Kong's not the only place in the world that does these things, but I hope very much that that we'll be able to work with people in Hong Kong on some of those questions to help us further our objectives. And Hong Kong's kind of strong capabilities in those areas mean that it's a place I'm sure that many of the projects that we're working with will sometimes want to work through.
I wanted to ask about the AIIB as a green bank, and I wanted to investigate that a bit further. So I guess kind of my broad question is, on what basis will the AIIB be deciding, which green projects to fund, how it understands projects to be green? Is it on a purely economic basis? So is there like a model for pricing externalities, reducing externalities? Or is it, I don't mean political, but I mean, let's say the bank decides our focus this year is green energy and that's what we're focusing on, and it's not decisions are made on a basis that is not just economics.
Well, I'd go back to some of the answers I gave earlier. Of course, projects that we're involved in have to be bankable. We're not offering concessional finance. We're not providing development aid, though our special fund can help to develop good projects. And of course, projects have to be consistent with the policies that we have, and you can look on our website at the very detailed environmental and social framework, policy framework that we have published that gives very detailed answers to some of those questions. And we're still working on the precise details of some of the strategy in those areas. And I guess there are some things that are obvious. Our members have made commitments in terms of their nationally determined contributions through the Paris process. Through domestic processes, infrastructure requirements will come out of that in order to help them meet those things. And so for us, taking the nationally determined contributions of our members is the right framework, the right place for us to start. There are clearly relatively uncontroversial areas like some forms of renewable energy, for example, which would be good areas of focus for the bank. But it's an area where we're developing our policies, developing our strategies. I think what I can say at the moment is that the bank clearly has a sort of strategic aspiration to play an important role in this space, and we're working on precisely how we can do it.
Thank you all very much for your questions. So we'd like to thank Sudhani for coming to speak to us today. We have a gift, which we will we'll give you in a second. But in the meantime, please can we thank Sudhani for giving up his time today. Thank you.